Private Members Business, consideration of Bill S-219, Journey to Freedom Day Act, in the name of Mr. Adler.
Mr. Adler, seconded by Ms. Ambler, moves that Bill S-219, an act respecting a national day of commemoration of the exodus of Vietnamese refugees and their acceptance in Canada after the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Debate. The Honourable Member for York Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. April 30, 1975. On that day, the Vietnam War ended. The capital city of South Vietnam, Saigon, fell to the communist invaders from the north. But that's not where the story ends. April 30th, 1975 began a new chapter in the lives of the people of South Vietnam. It was the start of the exodus of millions of people fleeing that country, the land they called home for generations. They were fleeing the harsh treatment and suppression of human rights by an authoritarian government, ethnic, religious, and political persecutions, political executions of former South Vietnamese officials and their families, forced resettlement in remote areas, and deteriorating living conditions brought on by food shortages, flooding, and drought. By 1979, some 600,000 South Vietnamese had fled. Over the next 3 years, the refugee label boat people became familiar as Vietnamese began trying to escape from their homeland aboard small watercraft seeking temporary refuge in neighboring countries. Many countries refused to allow them to land. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reported that at least 250,000 Vietnamese people lost their lives at sea due to drowning, illness, starvation, sexual assault, and violence from kidnapping or piracy while attempting to escape. In response to this humanitarian crisis, Canada responded by opening our doors. Between 1975 and 1976, Canada accepted some 6,500 political refugees who had left Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. In October 1976, Canada accepted 180 boat people. In August 1977, there was a further commitment for 450. In 1978, the government agreed to accept 50 boat families per month. By 1980, some 120,000 Vietnamese refugees were welcomed with open arms to Canada. Also, by demonstrating an ongoing concern, Canada aimed to encourage countries of first asylum to open their doors as well. By 1986, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees was so impressed by Canada's role in accepting so many refugees from South Vietnam, the people of Canada were awarded the Nansen Medal for their, quote, major and sustained contribution to the cause of refugees, end of quote. This medal is the refugee equivalent to the Nobel Prize and marks the only time in history that an entire country has been recognized in this fashion. That is why I am so proud to co-sponsor, along with Senator Than Hai Ngo, Bill S-219, or the Journey to Freedom Day Act, which will serve 3 purposes. First, it will establish April 30 as a day to commemorate the exodus of refugees from South Vietnam. Second, recognize the extraordinary humanitarian role played by the Canadian government, as well as Canadian families, voluntary agencies, communities, synagogues and churches, and religious groups who welcomed so many Vietnamese so warmly into the Canadian family. Third, it should also be noted that this period in Canadian history is one that is not as well known among younger Canadians today. And for that reason, April 30th should serve as a day of reflection and education. All Canadians should know the story of Vietnamese refugees who were forced to flee their native land, of the vast humanitarian effort that was undertaken by Canadians to welcome them, and of the triumph over adversity that the vibrant Vietnamese community in Canada represents. Canada was among the first countries to welcome Vietnamese refugees with open arms. When the people of Vietnam were in need, Canadians from all walks of life answered the call without hesitation and opened their homes and hearts to over 60,000 Indochinese refugees who desperately needed a place to rebuild their lives. This is the highest number of refugees per capita taken by any country in the world during this period. Canada's role in opening its doors to so many Vietnamese refugees is an example of the best of Canada, a true demonstration of Canadian values. Here's a little bit of how it worked. The federal government developed a private sponsorship program whereby institutions such as churches and groups of at least 5 adult citizens would take a refugee family into their care for a year. For each person sponsored privately, the government accepted another refugee under its own care. It was Canada that pioneered the private sponsorship refugee program, enabling our country to accept a much larger number of refugees while also reducing the cost to the government coffers and providing an example to the rest of the world. Without the warm and caring efforts of thousands of Canadians and the leadership and support and cooperation of the Canadian government, as well as refugee agencies, non-governmental organizations, and religious groups, the movement of such large numbers of people under such urgent and difficult circumstances would simply not have been possible. It is written in Scripture that he who saves a single life saves an entire generation. Today, there are approximately 300,000 people of Vietnamese origin living in Canada. More than 100,000 of them live in the Greater Toronto Area. On April 30th, for the past 39 years, Vietnamese Canadians have gathered to remember a new beginning and to thank Canada. In 2015, the Vietnamese Canadian community will celebrate the 40th anniversary of the resettlement of the Boat people to Canada. This bill speaks to Canada's long-standing tradition as a beacon of freedom and democracy, a nation that generously embraced refugees who were forced to flee their homelands through no fault of their own. Speaker, one of the more remarkable developments of this story is that today, many of those who came to Canada as boat people are today sponsoring refugees themselves. They have partnered with the Government of Canada under the leadership of our Prime Minister to bring to Canada the last remaining Vietnamese refugees that had been stranded without status in Southeast Asia, in places like Thailand and the Philippines, for nearly 40 years. And what a proud legacy, and what an amazing way to mark their journey to freedom by helping others. Now, this is an important bill, and today I ask for your support in moving it forward. National recognition of this day would serve as a point of pride for people of Vietnamese descent and for all Canadians, highlighting as it does the generous Canadian spirit and national respect for freedom. Our nation is one built by immigrants, and our communities are enriched by the vibrant mosaic of cultural heritage within them. Never again shall Canada's refugee policy be disgraceful and despicable as it was before and during the Second World War. A time when none is too many was the order of the day. Canada's warm, generous acceptance of immigrants and refugees is one of our nation's most sacred traditions. Our historic and continued commitment to diversity is one that we as a government must strive to recognize and honor whenever we can. This bill also provides an opportunity for all of us to reflect on our own commitment to a diverse and inclusive Canada. Canada, a place where we are all united in our values regardless of race, religion, color, or creed. It is so important for all Canadians to remember and reflect on our nation's history and how it has contributed to our current culture of pluralism, diversity, and acceptance. This bill also provides an excellent chance to reflect on the strengths and diversity the Vietnamese community has brought to our country, and to thank them for their contribution to our cultural mosaic. We can all learn something from the refugees who are willing to risk everything to live in freedom, because a life lived without freedom is no life at all. I, myself, am a first-generation Canadian, and this bill invites reflection on my own experience as a child of a Holocaust survivor, whose dad came to Canada with nothing more than a shirt on his back, a number tattooed on his arm, but most important, hope in his heart. For so many refugees who came to Canada, like the survivors of the Holocaust, the Vietnamese boat people, the persecuted Christians and Yazidis of northern Iraq and Syria, to so many others, each and every one of them had a right to turn their backs on humanity, yet they did not. They came to Canada in search of hope. Hope for themselves, yes, but more importantly, hope for their children, so they will not be forced to live under the yoke of oppression or persecution. They came to Canada because Canada is a beacon of light in the world, a country that stands tall and strong, adhering to the values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Colleagues, the Journey to Freedom Day Act would offer an opportunity to reflect on our commitment to the very best of Canadian values. It would give us yet another reason to showcase Canada as the best country in the world to call home. Today, I ask for your support to pass Bill S-219 and help us declare April 30th as Journey to Freedom Day in this great country of Canada. Thank you, Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member. Sorry. For Beauharnois-Salaberry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague opposite for his very heartfelt human speech. I'd like to ask him if we can talk about reconciliation, freedom of speech, democracy. Would the member advocate in committee that his government give the opportunity to all Vietnamese to give their opinion? Because we know that at the Senate committee, only testimony in favor of the bill was heard. So I hope that in committee, in order to have frank and genuine dialogue, talk about reconciliation and go forward and respect human rights, I hope we can hear all opinions from all Vietnamese.
The Honourable Member for York Centre.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and do thank the member for her warm words. But I do want to say that this bill is not about reconciliation. This bill is about remembrance, number one, and number two, to celebrate the great Canadian spirit, the Canadian spirit of remembering, of knowing who we are, of a great celebration of Canadian values, values of freedom, democracy, and human rights, and the rule of law. And we're here in the House today as an example of that. And we're debating this bill here in the House today. And I know what the honourable member is referring to, that at Senate committee, a representative, I believe it was the ambassador of Vietnam, had submitted a letter on behalf of the communist regime of Vietnam to give their perspective on the Journey to Freedom Day Act, which I understand they are vehemently opposed to. He submitted his remarks in writing. Unfortunately, they were not in French and couldn't get translated in time to be put into the record. But I would say that this is an important bill, and I would really hope that in the true spirit of our great Canadian values, that all members would support it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the comments made by the member. My question is actually based on the response to the previous question. In regards to the Vietnamese ambassador, we will have to eventually go to committee at some point. I would think that there's support for the bill to go into committee. And is he in a position where he could ensure those that might be listening or interested in presenting on his bill that he would be in support of that fair representation at the committee stage, so that all that want to have that input will be provided the opportunity?
The Honourable Member for York Centre.
Well, Speaker, I thank the member for his question, but when the bill was debated in the Senate, I looked at the record, and it appears that the Liberal Party, there were 4 votes against this bill and 14 abstentions against this bill. So I'm a little perplexed that, given that the Liberals seem to have already made up their mind that they won't be supporting this bill, that they would be interested in hearing from the communist views of the Vietnamese government. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but I think it would surprise even members of the NDP that the Liberals would be interested in hearing that, because I would be shocked that if the NDP would be against such a bill that would celebrate our great Canadian values of freedom and democracy, and yet, on the other hand, remember those who in their time of need were reached out by Canadians in their generosity and the great Canadian spirit of celebrating Canadian values and bringing so many refugees here to Canada who've made wonderful lives for themselves, and we as a country have benefited by their presence.
Reprise du débat.
Coming debate. The Honourable Member for Beauharnois-Salaberry. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise today in the House to discuss this very important bill, Bill S-219. It was tabled in the Senate and would create a national day of commemoration of the exodus of Vietnamese refugees and their acceptance in Canada. We often forget what it really represents being here, a democratic society where citizens can choose their members of parliament and where elected officials and citizens can exercise the freedom of speech safely. The majority of the population of the planet cannot exercise this fundamental right. If I rise today in the House of Commons because my parents fled Vietnam, sought refuge in Canada, started a family, and lived in peace, working to meet our needs. I, An Minh Tuệ Quach, was born and raised here in Canada thanks to the courage of my parents and because of the welcome we got from this country. Sorry, I get emotional saying this. I'd like to take a few moments to tell you how my parents fled Vietnam and came to Canada. In 1979, after the Vietnam War, my parents decided to flee their country because of the horrid living conditions imposed by the new political regime and in the hope of finding a better quality of life. They could no longer stand the constraints, the violence, and the injustice after the war. So they seized the first opportunity to flee in the middle of the night with my 2 brothers, who were 1 and 3 years of age at the time. They paid traffickers the last of their money to take a boat toward anywhere indicated and wondered whether the captain would bring them somewhere safe. They ended up in a refugee camp in Indonesia before the Red Cross got them. They came to Canada. They had no papers, no ID, no money whatsoever, no assets. They only had their lives and those of my brothers. Canada gave them papers and accepted them as refugees very generously. Bravo, yes indeed. So when they got here, they had to learn everything: surviving winter, speaking French, driving, finding a job, cooking the food they could find here, living in their new country. That's thanks to people, since Captain Pierre Pellerin, Ginette Malenfant, Nicole Leduc, Estelle, who's now died, who welcomed my parents, as well as other people. Many Canadians who opened their doors to welcome my family and thousands of Vietnamese as if they were their own family. From then on, many Vietnamese were able to try to settle in Canada and contribute to Canadian life, and thousands of thanks from all Vietnamese. Like more than 1.5 thousand people, or 1.5 million people rather, my parents were refugees by sea. Canada took 137,000 Vietnamese refugees. There were sponsors to take over these families and help them for a year. And for every sponsored person, the Canadian government accepted another refugee. So it was a movement of solidarity that was created. If you cross Preston and Somerset streets here in Ottawa, you'll see a monument to the both people. The Mayor of Ottawa at the time, Mrs. Dewar, the mother of our member for Ottawa Centre, deployed a great deal of effort to welcome thousands of Vietnamese refugees. The Chinatown here in Ottawa is essentially a Vietnamese neighborhood that serves pho soup that is very comforting on a day like today. The Vietnam War was the result of 50 years of Cold War, where the world was divided in two. Because of ideology, conflicts got into conflict, families were separated, men and women were killed. We no longer live in that bipolar world where each is trying to impose the truth. The time has come to impose genuine dialogue. I was talking about opening a dialogue earlier because we need this. The Vietnamese community here in Canada is divided. It's divided everywhere in the world because there are economic and political, religious divergences. And that is why we need a round table where everyone can have the right to express their views. That's how we can have some progress and make sure things change. I also think that S-219 is the perfect opportunity to just have that dialogue because it gives a positive spin on these commemorations because they emphasize Canada's welcoming of refugees.
Out of respect for our refugees and out of respect for Canadians who opened their doors to these boat people as of 1975, I think that it would be a good idea to allow everyone to conduct an open study in parliamentary committee. It is up to us, the children of the boat people, refugees, immigrants, and other Canadians, and who want to have this dialogue, to allow us to have this discussion on the appropriate commemorations. I had the opportunity to go to Vietnam and to visit my family, to see the family of my ancestors. It's such a beautiful country where people are exceptionally welcoming. I still have many people who live there, and they are members of my family, and I think those people should have the same opportunities as I do. They should be able to enjoy democracy, to benefit from it, and from the universal fundamental rights like I do. But that is not yet the reality in Vietnam for everyone. Vietnam has signed or is part of 7 international human rights conventions. It is a member of the UN Council for Human Rights. And human rights are in the country's constitution, and yet lawyers, journalists, bloggers, and citizens continue to be arrested, judged, and imprisoned simply because they have expressed their opinion. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but I'm going to have to blow my nose. I apologize. So I was saying that there are still people who are being imprisoned simply for expressing their opinion. Today, we cannot be afraid of telling the truth and speaking out. Every human being has the right to life, freedom, and equal opportunity. Therefore, I reach out to all Vietnamese who want to begin this dialogue with me, and to all Canadians, and with parliamentarians. S-219 gives us this opportunity for dialogue, because not everything has been thought through, and because I think we need to seize the opportunity to sit down around the table together, Vietnamese from all horizons, because there is a process of dialogue and healing that must be begun, so that we can look to the future. As the member across the way said, the ambassador of Vietnam was not able to be heard, but I have heard from other Vietnamese who live in Canada and who want to participate in this debate and who are not able to as part of the debate in the Senate. So this bill must follow the due process as part of the legislative process in Canadian Parliament, and I want it to be debated in committee, and I would like all viewpoints to be taken into account. Unfortunately, as we said, the Senate committee did not hear from all witnesses, and I think that this House, where we are elected officials, can do better. It can hear from all witnesses at second reading. And not only it can, but I think that it must, to express our values of openness and democracy and empathy and generosity, as we have done in the past. To do so, we must allow this debate to continue in this House so that there is no doubt on this. I'm asking these questions because I think the process can be improved. And in fact, I agree with this bill, but I think this debate must be continued. And on a more positive note, since the Asian New Year is going to be held on February 18th, I would like to wish everyone a very happy Tet. That is what we call the Asian New Year. So, to all Vietnamese across Canada and elsewhere.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I truly appreciate the comments that the former speaker has just put on the records, and I think she did a phenomenal job in terms of just expressing what I believe can be found throughout our country, and that is where we have seen families that come through refugee status to do so well, as I am sure her parents would be exceptionally proud, and community would be very proud of the speech that she's just delivered. Mr. Speaker, in regards to the person, the Member of Parliament that introduced the bill, S-219, I must say I'm somewhat disappointed in the manner in which he chose to answer the question. I look at S-219 as a bill that would be nice to see to go to committee. I am supporting the bill going to committee, and I do not appreciate the inference that the Liberal Party does not support S-219 going to committee. There is a great deal of value to it. Much like the former speaker, I raised the issue in terms of the importance of the committee hearing because it is something that was raised. And I do think it is appropriate, Mr. Speaker, and was somewhat disappointed with the member's approach in terms of whether or not, or implication that I might not be supporting the bill itself. And I do, Mr. Speaker, for a number of reasons, and I'd like to point out. But before I do that, Mr. Speaker, allow me to comment on the fact that just this last summer, I had the opportunity to travel to Vietnam. I have had the opportunity to visit countries in Asia, and it was a very enjoyable experience. I actually traveled with my daughter, and one of the things that she really appreciated was the number of scooters. She loves motorcycles. And if you ever get the opportunity where you're traveling in high-density areas, you get a good sense in terms of just the mobility and how so many people are able to get around in some very small areas. I personally enjoyed the marketplaces, the interaction. I had the opportunity to visit both small and medium-sized businesses. I can reflect on a candle store that assisted others with disabilities in being able to produce truly unique 100% beeswax type of candles to larger manufacturing plants, Mr. Speaker, or at least one plant in particular for wrappings. Mr. Speaker, it is a beautiful country, and at the end of the day, what this bill is proposing, and maybe I can make reference to some key messages that I think that we would like to emphasize, is that this day would recognize the journey, struggle, and sacrifice and survival of the Vietnamese boat people, and remember the historical significance of their travel here to Canada. Such a day would serve as an opportunity to raise awareness and enhance understanding of the plight of refugees around the world and what it is to endure the status of refugee. And, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to recognize that when we look at the bulk of the refugees, that not only was the majority not able to communicate, let's say, in English or French fluently, but it was also at a time in which there was some economic issues which were fairly challenging, which even complicated it more for a number of the refugees that ultimately landed here in Canada. This day would commend Canadian families, charities, religious groups, and non-governmental organizations who between 1979 and 1980 sponsored an estimated 34,000 Vietnamese refugees to come to Canada and assisted them in their resettlement and adjustment. This day would serve as an opportunity also to recognize the ongoing contributions of the Vietnamese Canadian people in all aspects of Canadian life and society, including medicine, engineering, business, science, law, academy, or academics, arts, media, civil and community services, and as demonstrated at the political level also, Mr. Speaker. These are community services and so much more that have allowed for great contributions from a community in which society as a whole here in Canada has grown to love and care for, and ultimately become a part of our multicultural fabric. My leader and many other members, I suspect, of this chamber, in particular, I have had opportunity. We know when I was first elected, I had the opportunity to serve as a multicultural critic for the province of Manitoba. And what an enriching experience that was. One of the privileges that I had was to go and visit what we call Saigon Centre, which is located in Winnipeg Centre. It is a housing complex, and the individual, Ba Tran, an individual that I've become very close to over the years, did a phenomenal job in terms of just educating not only individuals like myself, but others about what took place in Vietnam, the Vietnamese community that we're all so very proud of, and from my perspective in Winnipeg, knowing full well, of course, that it is in virtually all major centers now, and in rural communities. It's, as I say, in virtually every region of our country where we will see an enriched culture or heritage because of the Vietnamese contributions over the last number of decades. But just last year, might have been the year before, you kind of get crossed in terms of times. I can remember going from Saigon Centre, which is the beautiful housing complex, just down the block where we had a monument. A member made reference to a monument here in Ottawa. There's a monument also right across the street from the University of Winnipeg, which again highlights a very important part of Canada's history. Before I got a little bit off, I was making reference to a statement that my leader often makes a reference to, and that is that Canada's greatest strengths has got to be our diversity. It's our diversity that ultimately allows us, I believe, the greatest potential for our future. And we need to take a great deal of pride in who we are as a relatively young nation. And I have had the opportunity in the past to talk about Folklorama as an example, where Winnipeggers are often shared, Winnipeggers and people from the continent. In fact, we get other people from around the world that will participate in it. Through the different years, I think it's now been 30, 35 years, we have seen our Vietnamese community, as many other communities, get directly, if not indirectly, involved during different types of pavilions through different years. But it's a sharing of culture and heritage. And it is something in which I have really grown to appreciate virtually since I was first elected back in 1988. And I can say for the first 20 years of my elected life, every day I would drive by the Saigon Manor, which is a beautiful, I think it's an 8-story apartment complex and how it's enriched my life. Mr. Speaker, there are other things that I should quickly make reference to as time goes by so quickly. It's important for us to recognize in terms of the background, or if we're doing some sort of an analysis for the Vietnamese communities around the world, Journey to Freedom Day marks a significant day in their collective history. The day recognizes the fall of Saigon on April the 30th, 1975. The takeover of South Vietnam by the North and the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam government and the beginning of the mass exodus of millions of Vietnamese people from their homeland. Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of the Vietnamese migrants came to Canada as refugees on January 1st, 1975. 1,500 persons of Vietnamese ancestry were already living in Canada, predominantly in Quebec, I must say. After the boat people crisis between 79 and 82, some 59,000 individuals entered into Canada. And, Mr. Speaker, that grouping of wonderful people ultimately led to Canada being populated in virtually all the regions. And as I indicated earlier, it has enriched the quality of life for all Canadians. And I look forward to the bill ultimately going to committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very honoured to be able to speak today in favour of Bill S-219, and I want to, in particular, thank Senator Tan Hai No, the first Canadian senator of Vietnamese descent, appointed at the suggestion of our government to the Senate, and he does a very good job there, I must say, in representing the Vietnamese community across Canada. And I'd also like to thank my honourable colleague, the member for York Centre, for sponsoring the bill here in the House of Commons. And for the very eloquent speech he just made a few minutes ago. He's a person who, through his family history, knows of pain and adversity and a struggle to come to Canada. He mentioned his father, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, a victim of Dr. Mengele, and just a little over a week ago, on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz and Birkenau concentration camps, Mr. Speaker, he spoke about his father's struggles there and his journey to Canada. And what this bill for me is all about, Mr. Speaker, it tells the story, of course, of the Vietnamese Canadian community and their struggle to come to Canada, but it's a story that we have heard over and over again, repeated throughout Canadian history. It's a Canadian story. It's a story that represents all of us. So many Canadians have come to Canada from places torn by war, from great adversity, from oppression, and have struggled very hard through very difficult conditions to come to this country and found here a place of refuge and freedom. And this is the country that we all love so much. And I think it's incumbent upon all Canadians, regardless of the background, to learn these stories and to understand how these stories have contributed to our great country. So I appreciate the opportunity to voice my support for this important piece of legislation. And as I mentioned, it recognizes the lives lost and the suffering experienced by the exodus of Vietnamese people following the end of the Vietnam War on April 30, 1975, the day that Saigon fell to communist forces. That was a war, Mr. Speaker, as we all know, that raged for well over 10 years. It was bloody, it was violent. People's lives were torn apart. So many innocent lives lost. That's an anniversary. It's not a happy anniversary, but it's one that we must remember. We have to remember these events in history and how they affect people around the world, and especially those here in Canada. And Canada has played a significant role in aiding tens of thousands of refugees after the fall of Saigon, when, according to the United Nations Commission for Refugees, more than 1.5 million Vietnamese people were forced to flee their homeland under the threat of deteriorating living conditions, and it should be noted, widespread human rights abuses. During this humanitarian disaster that followed, Canadians rallied to offer whatever assistance they could. A crucial moment came in July of 1979 when a previous Conservative government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Joe Clark and his cabinet, at the recommendation of the then Immigration Minister, the Honourable Ron Atke, who I'd like to point out, Mr. Speaker, is a personal friend of mine, a person I've known for over 30 years, a very fine lawyer in the Toronto area today, and he exemplified, I think, the finest in Canadian government at the time when he recognized the plight of these Vietnamese people and agreed to accept 50,000 Vietnamese refugees over the following year. That's a very significant number for Canada to have absorbed in 1 year. This effort ultimately brought more than 60,000 boat people, as they were then called, to settle and build new lives across our great country. It is estimated that 34,000 were sponsored by Canadian families, Canadian charities, religious groups, and non-governmental organizations, and another 26,000 were assisted directly by the Canadian government. Throughout Canada, church groups and other community organizations sponsored families to come to Canada. I know that happened in significant numbers in my city of Mississauga, in the city that I grew up in Hamilton. Some of the young people who came with their families, I went to high school and university with earlier in my life. And I saw firsthand in their faces the pain that they had experienced in leaving their homeland and coming to Canada. It was the honourable member on the other side who mentioned what a shock it must have been for people to come to from a tropical place like Vietnam to a very cold place. Let's face it, here we are in early February in Ottawa, and any of us who've been outside today know it's very cold here, and what a shock that must have been to these people who had been through so much in their lives already. It was an unprecedented example, Mr. Speaker, of the compassion of Canadians towards a multitude of people in need. More than 250,000 Vietnamese refugees lost their lives at sea during the exodus from Vietnam. Just in traveling, 250,000 souls were lost. And you know that things had to be very desperate in their homeland for them to take those enormous risks to journey to freedom. Some were beset by illness, while others were drowned or were victimized by violence from piracy and kidnapping and other forms of violence. The arrival of the Vietnamese refugees in Canada and their settling into new lives in what was a foreign land to them stands as a shining example of how Canadians responded to a world catastrophe. Canada's compassionate response included many sectors, communities, and governments. Many Canadian families took the refugees into their homes and helped them find employment and schooling. It is considered an exemplary moment in Canada's history of humanitarian protection, and in fact was a contributing factor to the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees awarding its Nansen Refugee Award to the people of Canada in 1986. It was the first and only time that this prestigious medal was awarded to an entire nation. Due to the overwhelming success of the private sponsorship of refugees program during this time, it became enshrined as a fundamental part of Canada's refugee resettlement program. Contributing to the success story of the Vietnamese refugees who settled in Canada are the Vietnamese people themselves. Vietnamese Canadians are participating actively in public life in Canada, distinguishing themselves in business, politics, the arts, sports, and humanitarian endeavors. Here, Mr. Speaker, are just a few examples. Kim Phuc, an internationally recognized survivor of the Vietnam War who has established a foundation to assist child victims of war here in Canada. Paul Nguyen, a second-generation Vietnamese Canadian whose parents fled to Canada, is a 2010 recipient of the Paul Yuzik Award for Multiculturalism. Kim Tu is an internationally renowned author who received the Governor General's Award for her book telling her story of her arrival as a refugee. These are just a few of the many stories of great Canadians of Vietnamese heritage who have told their stories and contributed to the development of our country. Communities of displaced Vietnamese people around the world already refer to April 30th as Black April Day. Designating that day in Canada to honor our Vietnamese Canadian population would show our support to a community which has flourished in this country economically, culturally, and socially. Bill S-219 proposes, Mr. Speaker, to designate April 30th as the Journey to Freedom Day in Canada, as a day that would acknowledge the sacrifices made by the Vietnamese people during a very dark time in world history. Mr. Speaker, last Sunday, February 1st, I attended the annual Tet Festival celebration in Toronto, in Mississauga, at the International Centre near the Toronto Airport. The Prime Minister spoke there, Mr. Speaker, Senator No spoke there, and many other dignitaries. It was a room of 15,000 people. This is about the 8th time in annual time that I have had an opportunity to join with the Vietnamese people in celebrating Tet. And there were many speeches made there about this bill, S-219. And it was just astounding to me, Mr. Speaker, to see the overwhelming support of the Vietnamese community in Toronto for Bill S-219. They know that it tells their story. I also want to mention the Tribute to Liberty organization, which is constructing the monument to the victims of communism, very close here in the parliamentary precinct near the Supreme Court. The government has donated $1.5 million to that project. I would encourage all Canadians to go to their website at tributetoliberty.ca and make a contribution. The Vietnamese Canadian people will be a very significant part of those honored on that monument. They are an example of the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who were victims of communism who have struggled to come to Canada. So for all of these reasons, Mr. Speaker, to honour the more than 300,000 Vietnamese Canadian people in Canada who contribute to Canada's prosperity and growth and are hardworking members of our society, I want to encourage all of my colleagues here to support the passing of Bill S-219. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's a pleasure for me to rise in the House today to speak to the bill before us. First of all, without wanting to repeat what has already been said in this debate, I would like to note that I am proud today that we are speaking of the contribution made by Vietnamese Canadians to this country, and that I'm very happy that this bill is giving us once again the opportunity to thank them for their contributions to our communities across the country. In my riding of Pierrefonds-Dollard, there is a large Vietnamese Canadian community. It's very dynamic. It's not necessarily the most visible community, but it is very present and very involved in every aspect of community life. They are indeed very present, very integrated into the socioeconomic fabric of our community. I wouldn't be able to speak to this bill without saluting them and without recognizing their contribution to our community. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to take this opportunity to say that this commemorative day is possible because at a certain time in Canada's history, we opened the doors and we decided as a country, as a society, to welcome people who were seeking refuge following a major crisis, following a war that caused a great deal of human drama. Canada opened its doors and welcomed people who are now an integral part of the socioeconomic fabric of Canada. Why am I saying it this way? Well, as a critic for citizenship and immigration for the NDP, I must say that things have changed in Canada since that time. If I can give you one simple number to say that after this crisis, after this war in Vietnam, roughly 60,000 people from Vietnam were welcomed to Canada after the war. 60,000 people who sought refuge in Canada and who found it here in our country. Mr. Speaker, I must make the parallel between the current crisis in the Middle East and particularly in Syria with what happened many years ago. This is an unprecedented crisis in the Middle East. Hundreds of thousands of people are refugees within and without the country. And I would remind you, Mr. Speaker, that the minister has said that there are roughly 1,300 Syrian refugees who have been welcomed to Canada since the beginning of that crisis. Now, Mr. Speaker, a commitment of 1,300 refugees. And the minister has had an extremely difficult time respecting that commitment that he's made. And now if we compare that to the openness that we've seen in the past from this country, 30 years ago, when we welcomed 60,000 people who were fleeing a difficult situation in their home country. I think the numbers speak for themselves here. And I would like to go a little bit further and speak to the measures that have been implemented over the last few years that have caused this incredible disconnect, this incredible change that we've seen. For example, the changes made to the temporary health care program, which offered basic health care to asylum seekers in this country, and because of changes that the Conservatives have made, we now refuse health care services, basic health care services, to people who are living on Canadian soil. So health care to pregnant women, to children, Mr. Speaker, who are living on Canadian soil, who don't have access to the health care that they need to live safely within our own borders. I could also talk, Mr. Speaker, about the changes that have been made to the way that asylum seekers arrive in the country. Now, a group of people who arrive by boat, for example, fleeing a crisis in their home country and seeking asylum in Canada, would be automatically incarcerated and could be very easily sent home just because they came by boat, Mr. Speaker. As if, when we're fleeing a crisis, we choose the means of transport and the time that we will leave. These are people who are often victims or people who are seeking to offer a better future to their children or who want to save their children's lives. And finally, I could also talk about the list of originating countries. The fact that an asylum seeker comes to Canada and is from a certain country on this list of originating countries, which are, to sum up, are stable democratic countries, are listed as such. So if people come from those countries, they have a much lower chance of being accepted, and they don't have the same access to an appeal for their request for asylum. Now, Mr. Speaker, these are major problems. When we know that this list includes countries where there is discrimination for people's sexual orientation or for their ethnicity. For example, the Roma, who have been negatively affected since the Conservatives have been in power. The Roma are discriminated against. They face danger in their originating countries. But because they come from countries on, the wrong list, they're not able to seek asylum in the same way as asylum seekers from other countries. So these are just a few of the measures, Mr. Speaker, that have been changed under the Conservatives in recent years. And it's because of these changes that, today it would be it's impossible to imagine that we would welcome 60,000 people fleeing a crisis. Today we commit to maybe a few hundred or maybe 1,300 people when the need is much, much higher than that. And Canada has proved that welcoming a large number of people fleeing a crisis situation doesn't necessarily create an internal crisis in Canada. Quite the contrary. I think the opportunity is here to remind you that the 60,000 people who came from Vietnam after the war were welcomed. They integrated Canadian society. They are now full Canadians, important members of our society. They've proven that Canada is capable of welcoming people from other countries and that together we can build a better country. Because without these people who came from Southeast Asia, Canada wouldn't be the country that it is today. We're very proud to have welcomed them to Canada, and it's important to remember that at a time when there was a time when the United Nations recognized Canada's contributions to refugees around the world. It would be nice to go back to that time and say that, yes, we are still the Canadians that we were. Yes, we are still the country that we were then, and we want to welcome people. We want to do our part. When the international community turns to Canada in times of crisis, we want to do our part. The international community wants to know what Canada's role is today, and we could do better. I will end on a positive note, Mr. Speaker. We're talking specifically about Vietnamese Canadians today and their contribution to Canada. I would like to tip my hat to them, not only for their contributions to Canada, but in recognizing the challenges that they overcame. Let's remember that people who come to Canada seeking asylum, well, they face major challenges. Nobody chooses to be a refugee, Mr. Speaker. And when you have to leave behind very quickly people, places, climates that we love, well, Mr. Speaker, that's a major challenge that, for example, Mr. Speaker, I could hardly imagine it, but if we look at the success that these people have had, I have to congratulate Canadians in general for opening the doors and for welcoming these people with open arms. And I think that, Mr. Speaker, in this House we are unanimous in tipping our hats to all those who have come to Canada in difficult situations and are now part of the Canadian family.
We're resuming debate, and there are 4 minutes remaining this evening for the honourable member from Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise enthusiastically in the few minutes left in debate to support S-219, the Journey to Freedom Act. I have had and spent a significant amount of time in Vietnam in my previous life as a journalist in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, and had the dubious privilege of being in Saigon on that dark day of April 30th when I was lifted out of the American compound with the final Americans present, other third country nationals, and more than 7,000 South Vietnamese nationals. And I watched with great concern during the dark years of re-education through the late 70s and afterwards, and followed with great concern the plight of those who were forced through circumstance to leave their country and seek a better life elsewhere. I can reassure my colleagues who expressed concern, the members from Beauharnois-Salaberry and from Winnipeg North. This bill will be going to committee. It will hear witnesses across the spectrum, and I would say to the Vietnamese ambassador, and I look forward to seeing him during this coming committee study, that this bill is not a condemnation of the present government. We have close and good ties with the current government. This portrays a particularly dark period and the journey to freedom of hundreds of thousands of people, 60,000 to Canada. And in fact, freedom and democracy, greater freedoms, came to Vietnam not through war, but through the pressures of capitalism, free enterprise, and the will of the people for better lives in Vietnam. Mr. Speaker, just to conclude, the significance of the commemoration of Journey to Freedom Day is really threefold. It marks the tragic events following the fall of Saigon and the exodus of the Vietnamese refugees, but it also pays tribute to all those Canadians who rose to the challenge, to those who welcomed the traumatized refugees, and to help them to adjust to a new and better life in a new and unfamiliar land. And finally, it celebrates the incredible contributions that Vietnamese refugees have made to the building of our great country. This was demonstrated just last week at this year's Tet celebration in Toronto, where, Mr. Speaker, you'll recall the Prime Minister addressed a crowd of over 10,000 grateful Canadians of Vietnamese origin. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I think all Canadians should know the story of the Vietnamese refugees who were forced to flee their native land, of the vast humanitarian effort undertaken by Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and of the triumph over adversity that the vibrant Vietnamese community in Canada represents today. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
The time provided for the consideration of private members' business has now expired, and the order is dropped to the bottom of the order precedence on the order paper. The honourable member for Thornhill will have 6 minutes when this matter returns before the House.